Hi there, this is Catherine with Unfolded Heart Music. Welcome back to Lyre Foundations. Today we are going to begin part 2 of the course. This may be something that some of you have been waiting to do because we are going to start covering music theory and explaining how to read sheet music. So I hope you enjoy this. We're going to start with an overview and then go specifically through how to read on the staff today. So let's jump in. Okay, let's first start with a few broad and general comments about this chapter in general. So we'll do lesson 1 today, but just as a general introduction to chapter 4. So chapter 4 is all about the basics of music theory. I am, of course, not going to go into, an advanced level of music theory. It's not necessary, nor is it really fitting for this course. There are many, many great videos, though, on YouTube, and I'm sure other resources if you really want to understand music theory with greater depth, or maybe even as a supplement to what I am able to explain and what's appropriate for this particular course. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at those resources as well. Many videos and many creators really complement each other, so go for that. Take a look around. I don't have anything specific to recommend. I just know that they are out there. So this may not be absolutely everything that you need in your particular learning style or the way that the place that you're starting from. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay. So there's a couple of general things. The first is and you can read this paragraph, these couple of paragraphs on page 43. The first is just kind of what attitude that we want to be approaching this with. Some people get really overwhelmed by music theory, and some people maybe struggle to be patient or to wonder if they're really learning at a good rate in this particular area. There's many ways in which reading sheet music is kind of like learning another language. It is not nearly as hard as learning another language, so let me preface it with that, but it is something that we have to practice and something that we learn step by step. So just like you learned first the alphabet, and then you learned particular words, then certain sentence structures, and now you can read very easily without even thinking about it, without a lot of effort. The same kind of trajectory is also true for reading sheet music. So we're going to start small. We're going to start with even with an alphabet of a certain kind, and build up from there. And the more you read music, the more you play music by reading sheet music, the better you're going to get at it. And so even though there's a lot of effort that does need to go into it at the beginning in particular, just like anything, it also is something that as you do it, you're just naturally going to get better at it. So just be patient and know that, especially if you're starting from the very beginning of this as something you've never done before, just know it's going to take some time. Again, just like when you learn anything else. Okay. There are really kind of 3 different things that sheet music communicates to us. And so we'll go through each one of these as we go through the different lessons. And some of them will kind of fall into multiple categories, but they really are pretty clean categories, which is really quite helpful. The first is communicating what notes you are to play. So that is which string on the lyre that you need to play. So that's one thing that when you're looking at sheet music, traditional music notation, that's one thing it communicates to you. So what pitch? That's what we would say. So what note? The second is when to play these notes, and that has to do with rhythm, in particular, things like quarter notes, half notes, how long to let the note ring for, and the timing of when we play it. So not just which note, which string on here, but in what timing, and when we're using 2 hands, how those cooperate together. Okay. This also has to do a little bit with things like tempo and other adjustments in their different notations with that, but mostly it has to do with rhythm. And then the third is how to play them. And this really has to do with actually a few things we've already talked about, things like dynamics, things like articulations. This is kind of the icing on the cake in a lot of ways. So again, that's what notes to play, the pitches, when to play, the rhythm, and how to play them, articulations, dynamics, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to begin today with what to play. And if you can see at the very bottom of this introductory this general introduction on page 43. We're going to have lessons 1 and 2 really covering the what to play, lessons 3, 4, and 5 covering the when to play, and lesson 6 covering the how to play, very generally speaking. So that's a nice way to kind of organize all the information that you're going to receive. Okay, so let's go ahead and pause, and we're going to come back and really start lesson 1. Lesson 1 is clefs and note name. So here we go. All right, so now we're beginning lesson 1 of chapter 4. Again, this is about clefs and note names. You could also say this is about the staff and note names on there. All right, so those are the two main categories that we're going to be covering today. I'm actually going to start with the image on page 44. And what I'm going to do after I finish this video is kind of create a secondary video that illustrates or shows these different images so that I can point to different things. Otherwise, it won't be super helpful for you. Okay, so I'll add that in on the side. I hope that helps complement things. So let's look at the image on page 44. Prior to that, there's some vocabulary that is helpful for you to read through. It's a more really specific definition that I've written, and maybe is a little bit more thorough. But I'm just going to start with this image and really kind of talk through a lot of that vocabulary. But again, I think receiving it in two different ways is probably helpful for a lot of people, where you read it and then maybe you watch the video and listen to me explain it in a slightly different way. Okay, so let's look at this image on page 44, where we have two staffs, and then you can see things are labeled as treble clef, bass clef, and brace. Essentially, with this is called a grand staff, and you actually have two staffs in one. With one staff, you've got 5 lines and 4 spaces. Now, notes can also be on what's called ledger lines, where you go above that initial staff or below it, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So on each line or on each space, you can have a note. And depending on which space or line that note is on, tells you what pitch. So this again goes to the what to play. So if, for example, if I have a note on the bottom line of the top staff, that is an E, and it's a very particular E. It's not just any E, it is a very specific E in the whole grand scheme of all E's that we could have. If we were looking at a piano, there's about 5 or 6 different E's on there, and this note on that first line means this one specific E. And that's what's so helpful about the staff, is that rather than just writing a note name like A, B, C, D, E, F, or G, we know exactly which note it is. So again, each note can be either on a line, meaning if you have a whole note, which is like a circle, you'll have a line going right through it. You also can have notes in between the lines, which we just simply call those spaces, okay, where the line is not going through that note. This is true for both the top staff and the bottom staff that we can see. Now, the other thing that we have on these staffs are called clefs. We have treble clef and bass clef. Now, with the lyre, most lyres, the lyre that I have and that most of you probably have, your notes don't really go into the bass clef pitches of things, because it's just not low enough. It's a very high instrument. The pitches are very high. And so, for example, if you were to look at my sheet music, or maybe you already have some of that, you're going to notice that actually on both staffs, there's treble clefs. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. But there's multiple clefs. There's more than just these 2 clefs, but by far the most common are the treble and the bass clef. The reason we want to become familiar with the bass clef, even if you're not going to learn to read that very much, or it's not going to be super applicable for the lyre itself, is because if you want to take music, especially from things like the harp or the piano, and you want to be able to translate it to the lyre, you're going to need to adjust the range, and both of those instruments definitely use the bass clef. And so being familiar with how that clef works is really important to opening what you're able to do with the lyre in regards to taking that music from another instrument and translating it to the lyre. Okay. And so each of these clefs, what they do is they tell us what pitches go on each staff. So I told you a moment ago that if a note is on the bottom line of that top staff, which has the treble clef, we can see that label, that's an E. In contrast, a note on the bottom line of the bass clef, if there's a staff that has the bass clef, which we see on this bottom staff here, it's not an E anymore. It is actually a G. Almost spaced on that for a second. It's a G. And again, it's a particular G on the span of available pitches for us. So in contrast, again, when I use sheet music for lyre stuff, I usually have 2 treble clefs because I don't need pitches that are that low as the bass clef. And so in that circumstance, when you have a treble clef on both the top and the bottom staff, if I have a note on that bottom line, no matter which staff it's on, it means it's that same E, because that clef tells me what pitches, what those lines and spaces mean in regards to the particular pitch that is indicated there. Okay? So that's the role of the clef, is to tell us which one is which, basically. Otherwise, we don't know. We don't know what those lines and spaces indicate, only that something is sort of higher or lower. All right. Now, the other thing that we have labeled on this is what's called a brace. This is this kind of fun squiggly thing that connects the two. And basically all that tells us is that we're going to play those 2 parts, that is the notes on both of those staffs, we're going to play those at the same time. And kind of the fun thing about any 2-handed instrument where you can play multiple notes at a time is that you can essentially play 2 different parts, or even like 2 different instruments at the same time. Of course, you're only playing one instrument, but you can have a melody and a harmony, in contrast to something like a flute or a clarinet or a trombone, where you can only play one note at a time. And so you will never have what's called this grand staff, where you have multiple staffs that are combined by a brace, because you simply cannot play more than one note at a time. So for the lyre, as with other 2-handed instruments, we can have 2 staffs, which is really fun. And the brace tells us, oh, these belong together. These are for the same either section in an orchestra or a band, or a symphony, or the same section, or just that it's one part for one particular player. All right. In contrast, for example, if you have a orchestral score where you've got all different sections, you've got trumpets, trombones, tubas, clarinet, flute, oboe, bassoon, etc. You've got all these different lines, but you won't have them connected with the brace because they are completely different parts, not meant to be played by a single group or a single person. Okay, so that's the staff. That's kind of the almost like the canvas on which we communicate everything else that has to do with sheet music and these particular notes. All right, let's shift down to this title where we see music alphabet. I kind of stole this actually from not the content, don't worry, just that name, music alphabet, from the introductory piano books that I use for my students. And anyways, it's sort of funny because it really is just the regular alphabet, it's just shorter. So in music, you go, essentially, the notes available to us, we only go to G. So you can have a note that's A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. After that, you simply start over. So there is no such thing as an H note on here, right? I would never point to this and be like, find me the L or find me the P. It does not exist in music. We only go up to a G. So then the question is, well, what happens when we reach the G? You simply start over. And so we would start over, and this is illustrated in that image below, where we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you start over again, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So it's all a pattern. If you were to look at a piano, there's 88 keys on a piano, but there's really just a pattern of a few notes that repeat over and over and over again on them, which is very helpful in regards to orienting yourself to the instrument. The same is true with the lyre. So for example, on let me see if you can see this. Oh, let me back this up. On my lyre, just as on yours, depending on how many strings you've got, we start over. So I've got F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F. So we're back to F again. Keep going to G. Again, we don't go to H, we go to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So we see that it really, again, is just a pattern that repeats itself. Now, your lyre is going to start maybe on a different note. If you've got a Brandon John 19 string, or maybe another 19 string that uses the same notes, that's awesome. It's going to be the same. But maybe yours actually just starts on a G because you've got a 16 string. It'll be the same thing. It's just that you start on G and you work that pattern, which is always going to be in alphabetical order. You work that forward, and then again, once you hit G, you start over at A. Okay? So it's just a sequence, it's just a pattern that starts over and over again. Okay, so that's the first part. We have this sort of alphabet that indicates which pitch we play. Accompanied with that, though, and this is not always commonly written, but for the purposes of clarity, I've written it here, you also have a number that is associated with a particular note. I'm just going to tighten this string real quick. And that number tells you essentially what octave to play in. And what I mean by an octave is how high or low. So for example, well, let me move this back. For example, we have a C here. We also have a C here. And we have a third C here. So if you were just to tell me play a C, I wouldn't know which one of those three you want me to play. And so these are at what's called different octaves, and they are higher and lower, even though they're the same. They have the same wavelength. We won't get into physics. They have the same wavelength. They have the same pitch. They are just, again, of course, some of them are higher, some of them are lower than others. Okay, and so this first C is what we call C4. It's actually middle C on the piano. Okay, and just like with the alphabet, we always go up. With the numbers, the octave numbers, we also simply go up, just like you're counting something. So this is C4, this is C5, and this is C6. Okay? Take a closer look at these images on page 44, the second half, the bottom half of this, to kind of understand how these numbers shift. You'll notice that they shift on C. So for example, when we look at the 16 strings, we have G3, A3, B3, and then C4. So we move up to the next number when we hit C. Again, we go C4, D4, E4, F4, etc. Excuse me. Until we get to the next C, and then we shift up one number, C5. Okay? And that continues all the way up. I've illustrated here below the most common strings, common string setup that is available for 16 and 19 string lyres. So take a look at that and familiarize yourself with those particular notes. Okay, I'm going to pause now. I forgot to pause before the musical alphabet, let you process that. Make sure that you're really clear on all of that before we move forward. We're going to go to note names for each clef after this. Okay, let's shift now to looking at what notes are for each clef, belong on each clef. Again, before you move forward on this, make sure that you understand two things. Make sure you understand the staff and how that works, and also understand which strings, which pitches you have on your particular lyre. Because what will be very helpful as we go through each of these clefs is to be able to identify the note as it's written on the staff with your lyre. Because obviously what we want to end up doing is making that connection. Otherwise, when we read sheet music, we're not able to translate it to our lyre, and that completely defeats the point. So there's sort of two steps to reading notes on sheet music. One is simply identifying, okay, is this an E, an F, a G, etc. And the second is knowing where that note is on your lyre. So I would make sure to practice both of those aspects, identifying it on the sheet music and identifying it when you see it on the sheet music on your lyre. Okay? So we first look at the treble clef. We're on page 45 now. We first look at the treble clef notes. And you can see I've already labeled them here. From the bottom line to the top line, we start with E4 and end on F5. Okay? Now, there's two ways that we typically will memorize this. We have these little sayings, little words and sayings, both little mnemonics, so little helpful shortcuts so that we can help memorize this order of notes. What you don't really want to do is to say, okay, well, I know that on treble clef the bottom line is E, and then I can just count up from there. That's a very slow way to read sheet music, and it's not going to be very effective for very long. Just like you don't want to look at your lyre and have to figure out, oh, this, whatever you've colored it, your blue or your red string, I know that's a C, and so I know that, whatever, this is a G only because I have to count up. You want to be able to visually see it and identify it very quickly so that when you're playing, you can utilize those visual skills instead of just your muscle memory to identify that. So counting up or counting down is not really something that we want to be practicing here. It's okay at the very beginning, especially just to double check yourself, but what we want to do a little bit more is to use these mnemonic suggestions or kind of little tricks to help you be able to identify the note more quickly on its own, not necessarily in relation to other notes as much. And then eventually, just like, again, when you learn to read as a little child, you had to sort of sound out that word at first. And now when you look at it, you just know what that word is. You don't really have to think about it. The same is true for memorizing the notes on the staff. You'll be able to see that a note is on the third space, for example, and you just know that that's a C because you've seen it so many times. But that's something that you can't really force. That's just repetition at work. Okay, so what are these mnemonics? There's two different ones, one for space, one for lines. The first one, this is by far the easiest one, is that the notes on the spaces in the treble clef spell the word face. So starting from the bottom and going to the top, they spell the word face, F-A-C-E. So the bottom space is F, the second space A, third C, fourth E. Okay? And so that's something much faster than counting up every single line and space. If you see, oh, that note is on the top space, F-A-C-E, E. Okay, it's E, and you can identify it much more quickly. Sometimes people will only memorize the spaces and then be able to figure out the lines in between those. I think that's a perfectly okay way to do it. It just depends on what works better for you. So for example, if I had a note that was on the second line from the bottom, I would know, okay, this is between F and A because I know those spaces are F and A. What note is going to be between F and A? Well, it's in alphabetical order, and so I go from F, G is next. After G, I know is A. So I know G has to be on that line. So that's one way to do it. But if you would prefer, you can also simply memorize the mnemonic for the lines. There are several different ones. The most common one is every good boy does fine. Excuse me. So E on the bottom, G, B, D, and ending with F at the top. All right. Now we shift to the bass clef. It works the same way. They're just simply different notes. And so the spaces for this one is all cows eat grass. We have A at the bottom, G at the top. A, G, E. Excuse me, A, C, E, G. All cows eat grass. And then for the lines, it's good boys do fine always. So very similar to the mnemonic suggestion for the lines in the treble clef, but a little bit different. We're starting on a G instead of an E. Good boys do fine always. So spend some time, familiarize yourself with that. Decide how you want to go about memorizing those, and really do memorize those mnemonics because that's going to come in handy a bit later. All right, then the last thing is ledger lines. Ledger lines are simply a way to extend the staff either above or below. One thing I want to help point out and make sure this is very clear is that when we start using ledger lines, the staffs start to sort of come together. The notes, basically you can end up writing the same note on the bass clef and on the treble clef, but it is actually the same pitch. So it'd be the same string. And which is why technically you could use the bass clef to indicate some of these bottom notes, and it would be a very appropriate way to do that. I personally think that's a little bit less simple, I suppose, and it's just easier to read and easier to write to keep it all in the treble clef, because we have this middle C right here, and then we actually start going down to ledger lines on this A, G, and F. If it went any lower than that, I probably would just stick with the bass clef, but since we don't really start traversing into bass clef territory until these bottom four, I decided not to do that. So just some context for that particular way of writing. Okay, so let's look at this example though, how this actually works. We're on page 46 at the top. So again, we're just extending the staff with these different lines. So it works the same way. You can have notes in spaces and you can have notes in lines. And we're looking at the treble clef first. So we're going down, all right? Anytime you go towards the bottom of the page, towards the bottom of the staff, you're going to lower pitches. So you're traveling that way, okay? If you are going up on the page or up on the staff, you're going to higher notes. Similarly, if you are going down, you're going to go in opposite alphabetical order, backwards alphabetical order. If you're going up, you're going to go in normal alphabetical order. Okay, so just keep that in mind if you're trying to figure out the notes and you're going in alphabetical order, but you're going lower in pitch, you're going the wrong way. You have to do your ABCs backwards, because otherwise it's just the wrong note. It's just the wrong note. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so these first, 2, 4, 6, those first 6 notes are going lower. So we are starting, let me see if you can see this. No, okay. What we're starting off on is D4, which is right here. D4. Then we travel down to C4, B3, A3, G4, G3, and F3. Okay. And we use that because we're going even lower on the instrument, lower on the staff. We need to use those ledger lines to indicate that. Otherwise, they're just floating and we have no idea which line or which space they're on. And you could theoretically just keep going down, but as you might imagine, it gets really hard to read that music if we continue to go down. That's why we then have the bass clef to basically continue that staff, but in a cleaner way rather than using ledger lines to extend it. Okay, but these lines indicate the same note. So this little kind of smaller staff at the bottom here is where it has the bass clef on the left-hand side. What we're seeing is that, for example, this D4 can be written in 2 different ways. You can either write it as a note that's kind of right under the staff on the treble clef, or you can write it as a note that's above the first ledger line on the bass clef. Because these 2 clefs meet in the middle. This C is called middle C because it's what splits the treble and the bass clef. So we basically have treble from here to here. This is true on a piano or a harp as well. And then bass clef, from this middle C down to the bottom. So that's kind of where that split is. And so you can see why I use the treble clef, because the vast majority of the lyre is in the treble clef realm of things, whereas really only a tiny bit is in the bass clef, and we can just use ledger lines to communicate that. So just so you know where this connection is between what notes are on the staff and what notes, how that correlates to the actual strings on your lyre. So again, we've got D4 here, and because this is all treble clef up here, we're still really in the treble clef range. But we could indicate it in the bass clef because the bass clef starts really kind of right here on this middle C. All right, we see the next note in that next measure. We see C4, which I told you earlier was middle C. We see that, and it hovers below the treble clef and above the bass clef. So again, it splits those really in 2. Okay? So the same note can be written on the bass clef or treble clef. if it is going to be that way, the treble clef note, that same note is going to be on the bottom of the treble clef, whereas on the bass clef is going to be on the top because they meet in the middle. Okay? All right, so that's the treble clef and bass clef. We can see then on the right hand how ledger lines work when we're going up. Now this lyre goes up to, it's called just a high C, which is C6. So that's 2 ledger lines up. If it had 2 more strings, it would go up to E6. And then farther than that, we actually would use a slightly different way of indicating the note. But that would be really quite high, and it's not really a pitch that's used all that often, even in larger instruments. All right, so just so you know, again, where this range is, that G5, that's the first one above this treble clef, is going to be this G right here. So G5, A5, B5, and C6. Okay? All right, on the flip side of this, now most of these I can't show you as well because I don't have that range on the lyre, but looking down at the bass clef, same kind of thing applies, just in the other direction. So if we look at not the top tiny staff, but the larger staff where it has the bass clef on that particular staff, we see that we've got B3, which is here, going up to C4, D4. Now we're up really in ledger lines with E4, F4, G4. And you can see, again, this is where, right here is where we're going to start splitting between treble clef and bass clef. And so you can see we're actually quite far into that treble clef once we're on that 3rd ledger line. Again, you don't usually indicate with ledger lines beyond that because you would just switch into treble clef. It's much easier to read that way. Okay, but again, you can then see the lines that are indicated on this page, showing you where these same notes are written in the treble clef. So this B3, just like we saw a moment ago, can be written in the treble clef as hanging down below the 1st ledger line underneath the staff. And then we move up into a more normal range on the treble clef. Okay, and then finally, we can see in the bass clef, we can also have ledger lines going down. Obviously, this is not even close to being low enough to really illustrate these. But you can see that we go from F2 all the way down to A1 as we go down in those ledger lines. All right, so that's how those work. Again, ledger lines are a way just to extend the staff. I then, after this, have lots of practice, both with treble clef and bass clef. Make sure you're looking at the clef as you work on this. So I would encourage you to do this little practice exercise. Then the answers are on page 48, right when you flip the page. The other thing that you could do if you've gotten this kind of, pretty much down, is with the treble clef ones in particular, go ahead and practice finding those notes on your lyre so that you're making that further connection between not just can I identify the note on the staff, but can I identify this note on the staff with a particular string and pitch on my lyre. Again, take your time on this, and just this will come more and more easily as you simply do it, and those connections are just made in practice. All right, let's do some final comments, and then we'll wrap it up with that. Okay, I hope this has been a helpful introduction to reading music on the staff, especially for those of you who've been sort of waiting for this to begin so that you can do the other exercises with a little bit more ease. That would be another way, actually, to practice this. If you have done this section, even before really moving forward in a certain sense, you could then go back to different practice exercises and practice reading those notes on the staff and playing those on your lyre. That would be an awesome and really helpful way to continue to integrate all this information so that it more and more becomes second nature. Next time we're going to be looking at scales and key signatures, and this is going to be before we move into rhythm. So we will get into rhythm, but we're not quite there yet. We want to understand how these notes can come together to form a different scale and also a different key. They kind of go together. So come back for that. That'll be lesson 2 in chapter 4. Of course, if you have any questions, if I can help you in any other way, let me know that. I'd be happy to lend a hand as I'm able. Check out other stations as well if you really could benefit from maybe having this information presented with a slightly different way. Everybody teaches a little bit different, so I'd really encourage you to do that if this is your first time learning this information. I hope things are going well. Thank you so much. God bless you, and may the peace of Christ be with you. Thanks again.